in that sense, a vital democracy. And what has occurred over the last 40 years because of this is a massive transfer of wealth, into just the hands of a few people, to the point where 1% of all Americans own more wealth than the bottom 90%. We have the greatest wealth inequality since 1929, and we are now at a situation where 93 million Americans live near poverty. 93 million Americans living near poverty means tens of millions of Americans every single day live with chronic economic anxiety. These are not just numbers. These are human beings' lives. These are millions and millions and millions of people who live every single day not knowing what would happen if they got sick, having no idea what would happen if one of their children got sick, having no idea how they will send their children to college, and having no idea how they will get out from under these college loans. This is the richest country in the world. I've had a career for 35 years in which I've helped people, I've worked with people. I signed up for that, to work with people during times of crisis. I understand that. And certain crises happen in life. You get sick, or somebody that you love gets sick, or you find out that your child is addicted and it's heroin, or your business goes under. These things happen. But what started to happen in my career about 15 or 20 years ago is that I started seeing too many people in trouble. Given the fact that this is the richest country in the world, too many people are living under tension, under anxiety, under very difficult circumstances that should not be in the richest country in the world. People who do everything right and people who have done everything right. I met a woman just the other day here in New Hampshire who is 50 some odd years old. She still has a $400 a month payment on her college loans. At what point is somebody supposed to be able to relax? Another woman that I met here in New Hampshire, her children, she has 4 children. Her husband is a New Zealand citizen. Her children, they simply could not afford college for these kids, and so the children could get free college in New Zealand. Great, they all went to New Zealand, and guess who's going to get the economic benefit of the fact that these young people have been educated and they're going to live and pursue their dreams in the country that has given them this? Guess who's going to get the economic benefit of all that? New Zealand. We are living at a time where we have reverted to an aristocratic paradigm. An aristocratic paradigm was what we repudiated in 1776. In 1776, we repudiated the notion that only a few people would basically get to have the opportunities of wealth, the opportunities of education, and the opportunities of wealth creation. We said no to that in 1776, and ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, it is time to say no to it again. And it is a great American tradition to push back against capitalist forces when they have become unfettered from ethical consideration. Overreach by capitalism, that is what people are supposed to say no to, and that is what our government is supposed to protect us from. Instead, our government has become a handmaiden to those forces. When you have something like the Environmental Protection Agency that was set up to protect the environment, that is now headed by an ex-chemical executive, and before that by an ex-oil company lobbyist, when you have something like the opioid crisis that has caused so much devastation here in New Hampshire, and you have attorneys general all over this country that are now prosecuting pharmaceutical company executives. Why? Because they knowingly over-manufactured painkillers, they knowingly led to confusion on the part of both consumers, doctors, and pharmacists as to the addictive nature of these narcotics, and they knowingly led to the overprescription of these drugs. But we have a bigger problem than that. The problem that you and I need to ask ourselves is, where was the FDA when all this was happening? Who was looking the other way? Who was obviously signed up to do more, to be in bed with, to be cozy with, and to aid the profit maximization of pharmaceutical companies than to advocate for you and me? For that matter, where was the FAA when Boeing cut those corners that led to the Boeing MAX disaster? The problem is not just that those Boeing planes crashed. The problem is that the Boeing company cut those corners and the FAA was looking elsewhere. That is what has happened. the short-term profit maximization of these huge multinational corporations, even to the point of this level of devastation, is now a kind of economic tyranny under which we are living. It is the most American thing. It is the most patriotic thing. It is the most traditional thing for a generation to rise up and say, that stops now. And for those of you here in New Hampshire, all of you are here in New Hampshire, I want you to be very clear of the role that New Hampshire has played in our past. Remember, in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, on one hand, the men who signed that declaration were very, very brave people. They were brave because if, in fact, the British had won the war, these men would have been tried and I'm sure executed as traitors against the King of England. But something else went on there. Although they signed a document that established the most aspirational and the most enlightened principles that had ever formed the core of the founding of a nation, 41 of them were themselves slave owners. That dichotomy has been with us from the beginning. That bipolar nature of the American character is built into our DNA. We are, on one hand, a country founded on the extraordinary possibility that anyone, no matter who they were, no matter who they are, no matter who their parents were, no matter what class they belong to, because theoretically there's not supposed to be a class, no matter what their religion or absence of religion, no matter what their ethnicity, no matter what their culture. This was a radical idea in 1776, and it's a radical idea today, that theoretically anyone should have the opportunity to win, and that it is the role of government to remove whatever shackles would keep them bound. But at the same time, from the very, very beginning, and this has been true of every generation, and it's true in our generation as much as in any other, it is also true that the United States has also included forces which perpetrated in the most violent ways transgression against the principles on which we purport to stand. On one hand, the Declaration of Independence. On the other hand, 41 of the signers, slave owners. That's where it began. But in the narrative of our history, we do tend over time to self-correct. That's what's so amazing about the American story. So yes, we had slavery, but then we had abolition. And this is where New Hampshire comes in. The abolitionist movement was founded in many ways by the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. It was founded by the early evangelicals and the Quakers. And I want to remind you as well that many of the women who were part of the Women's Party, which rose up and caused women's suffrage through the women's suffragette movement, they were Quakers as well. In other words, we had slavery, but then we had abolition. We had the institutionalized suppression of women, and then we've had two major waves of feminism, and we had the women's suffragette movement. And then we had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. But then we had the civil rights movement. But in all three of those cases, this is also true of the marriage equality movement. It's true of every single great social justice movement in this country's history. It has not once been that the U.S. government woke up and decided to repair itself. In every single instance, it was the people who rose up, the people who rose up, and the people who stepped in. A political status quo does not disrupt itself, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else. A political status quo perpetuates itself. Now, our country is going through just another iteration of the same kind of paradigmatic contest that other generations before us have been through. The only question is, are we going to be the first one to wimp out on the job? Are we going to be the first one to wimp out on the task before us, which is to put this country back on track? Today, it's not one institutionalized reality that we need to just excise from our midst. Were it that simple? We knew we had slavery, we needed to end slavery. We knew we had the institutionalized suppression of women. They thought, well, if women could have the right to vote, that they could vote the changes they need. We knew we had segregation, institutionalized white supremacy, and we knew we had to dismantle segregation. Today, it's more complicated. Today, it's more like a cancer that has already metastasized. Today, it's like a cancer being wrapped around healthy organs. You don't want to blow up your government. You don't want to blow up your economy. You don't want to blow up all corporations. You have to recognize exactly where the corruption is. It has to be nuanced, but it has to be powerful. But I will tell you this much, ladies and gentlemen, and this is why I'm running for president. If you think that the political establishment that created all this is going to fix all this, you're being had. Because that's not what happened. The idea that the same political establishment that drove us into this ditch now claims they're the only ones we should possibly consider qualified to drive us out of the ditch.
Like Big Donnie.
Pardon?
Excuse me, like Big Donnie. Mm-hmm. They would create it and he'll fix it.
Now, well.
Sorry.
We are living at a time where we have gotten a power inversion here. The government works for us. We're acting like we work for them. We have forgotten who we are in relation to our own first principles. We have forgotten who we are in relation to the Declaration of Independence. These principles are written on marble walls somewhere, and they're written on parchment, and they're behind glass in Washington somewhere. But if they're not inscribed on our hearts generation to generation, then they lose their moral force. It is said in the Jewish religion that every generation has to discover God for itself. And every generation has to discover the principles of American democracy for ourselves. Or it becomes deadened. Where is all this, we're not going to say no, that we're going to say no to tyranny? What happened to all that we say no to tyranny stuff? It turns out that the American Revolution is an ongoing process. And how naive we ever were to think otherwise. If you don't tend to your marriage, don't go being surprised if you lose your marriage. If you don't tend to your business, don't go being so surprised if you lose your business. And if you don't tend to your health, don't go being so surprised that you lose your health. But we became, the best and the brightest of Americans became too often over the last few decades disengaged, chronically disengaged from the political process. And so the more disengaged we became, the more toxic it became. The more toxic it became, the more disengaged people became. The more disengaged we became, the more toxic it became, and look where we are now. But the people are awake now. I don't think the issue is that people don't realize we're in trouble now. But I do believe that many of us realize going back to the system as it is, to try to repair the system as it is, lacks depth of understanding of what really went wrong here. We need to do more than address the symptoms. We need to do more than just tweak a policy here or tweak a policy there. We need to recognize the root causes of this problem, and we need to root out the root causes at the root. It starts, as I said, with the economic corruption of trickle-down economics, the fact that this has corrupted our government. And the undue influence of that corporate money is the cancer underlying all these other cancers. That is why we have contaminants in our water. That is why we have carcinogens in our food. That is why we have toxins in our air. That is why you have 93 million people living in near poverty. That is why we have 13 million American children who are hungry. That is why we have 100,000 children who are homeless. That is why we have a national defense agenda, a national security agenda which is dominated not by any effort to even realistically think it would be possible to actually wage peace on this earth, but by a principle of short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. Does it even occur to most people that only 2 people in this campaign are even discussing that? We don't have universal health care because of health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies. We don't have simply reasonable gun safety laws because of gun manufacturers. We have so many of the water contaminants and the food carcinogens and the toxins in our air because of chemical companies and because of food companies and because of agribusiness and because of oil and gas. And as I already mentioned, we do not have any kind of a national security agenda that even tries to practice the moral authority, the moral leadership that all of us were brought up to believe America should stand for around the world because of defense contractors. And not only that, very little of what I just described is even discussed in this presidential campaign. We have one major political party which is so in bed with these forces as to say, yeah, What of it? And we have another major political party who does want to remove the pain on the periphery. That I will give them. They certainly want to take away whatever pain is possible on the periphery. But because they're in bed economically with those same corporate forces, they too will not address the deeper forces and challenge the deeper forces that make all that pain inevitable. That's what's going on in this country. That's what's going on in this country. Now, I'm a Democrat. But I'm a Democrat from the Democratic Party that I grew up with, and that was the Democratic Party of Bobby Kennedy. That was a Democratic Party which wasn't trying to have it both ways. Now, this is the deal. If we do not do some radical truth-telling, if we do not get down and say what's really going on in this country, then I do not feel we will even have the power to defeat the big lies that are coming at us from the other side. Kind of, sort of truth. You know, all of the Democratic nominees are telling you the truth. I'll give you that. I mean, they're all good people. This is not about individuals. This is about a system. So they're all telling you the truth. But you know what? We need to go deeper than that. We need to be like when you're in a court of law and you raise your hand and you swear to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, we need to get real. I've worked for 35 years up close and personal with people whose lives were in crisis. And I know something about what it takes to move from crisis to opportunity. You know what you have to do? You have to look in the mirror. You have to take a brutally honest look at yourself. You need to say, where am I and where am I not who I say I am? Where do I and where do I not practice the principles on which I purport to stand? Where are my own character defects? And if I don't know what they are, my best friends can probably tell me. Where do I have something that I need to clean up? Where do I need to be willing to say, okay, I need to atone for my mistakes. I need to make amends for my past. Where do I need to clean up the past? Where do I need to rise to the occasion? Where do I need to stop pretending? Where do I take an honest look at what's true? Where do I need to live for someone other than just myself? And when you do that, miracles happen. When you do that, breakthroughs happen. When you do that, life does start over in extraordinary ways. But when you do anything less, all you will do is just recycle the same problems. The symptoms will simply morph into other symptoms. Now, there are two things that we have to think about, those of us who do not wish to see Donald Trump win another term. Number one, and I agree with whoever just moaned. I tell you something. You think it's bad now? I'll tell you something chilling to consider. Give that man another term.
No way.
All right, now listen. The issue is, if we just beat him, but we do not dwell in a deeper conversation about what seriously needs to be transformed, then they'll be back. Those same forces will be back in the midterms in 22. They'll be back big time in 24. We need to do more than not go over the cliff. We need to get out of the vicinity of the cliff. We need more than just to change some policies. We need an awakening and arousal of consciousness among the American people. And I believe that many of us need to take ownership and responsibility for the fact that we let it get this bad. This has been going on for 40 years. He is a natural, inevitable product of the kind of deeper level of dysfunction that we have allowed to corrupt our democracy. And so what has happened is he's like an opportunistic infection. It could never have gotten hold of us had there not been a weakened societal immune system. Donald Trump is more than a politician. Donald Trump is a political phenomenon. The only thing that will override that in this next election is a phenomenon of our own. But we don't believe in the phenomenon of one human being. That is an undemocratic concept. The phenomenon we need is an awakening of awareness among the American people, an awakening of the American people who get to the point of realizing this is serious now. This is not just about me. This politics of people pleasing is disgusting. I'll figure out what your group wants to hear, and so I'll say this to you. I'll figure out what your group wants to hear, so I'll say this to you. Gay people, I'll say this to you. Black people, I'll say this to you. Jews, I'll say this to you. Women, I'll say this to you. I'm not here to say what I think you want to hear. I'm here to say to other adults, we have a country in trouble. This isn't about you, and it's not about you, and it's not about you, and it's not about me. It's about what all of us need to do to come together now. Our country is in trouble. You see, I have found in my 35-year career that when people are in trouble, when people get bad news, when the doctor says the test results came back and they're not good, when somebody finds out that their child is addicted and it's heroin, when people learn that their business is going under, it's over. What I have seen over and over and over again is that that's when people get really smart. It's almost counterintuitive because you think, oh, that's when people fall apart. Maybe people fall apart for a few minutes, but then if I'm the doctor, if I've done some tests, you expect me to be honest with you, not to say, oh, let's not talk about it because it's negative. You expect me to tell you the truth, and you're going to listen to me very seriously because then we're going to have to talk about what your healing options are. So what I have learned, and I live my own life, we all know this, living our own lives. Yes, you hear bad news and all of the unimportant preoccupations that so often dominate our lives, the ultimately unimportant things, just fall away in the first 5 minutes. And we find out how smart we are. And what I have seen over and over again is that we are smart people, and we are noble people, and the American people are good people. We are a good and a decent people. I'm not saying we're better than other people. I don't think we're better than other people. But we are a good and decent people. And when it comes to our personal lives, we seek to be good people. And when it comes to our personal lives, we can act pretty intelligently. But our public policy does not reflect right now either our goodness, our decency, or our intelligence, because it is so beholden to short-term profit maximization that has no concern for decency, no concern for goodness, and no concern for any higher intelligence. Now, politics needs to be a place right now where we get very smart. This needs to be a time where we come together and we're not just here because of what you want or what you want or what you want, but because we have to pool our intelligence and talk about what we're going to do now. But the political system infantilizes us. The political establishment, their operatives actually tell them, try to talk to people like they're just kind of at the level of 14 years old. They call that winning politics. But the problem is a 14-year-old probably doesn't have the ability yet to process things on the level that we need to process. So like I said, I'm not here to talk to you about what I think you want to hear in order to get your vote because you'll be happier. That's not what this is about. This is about all of us entering into a much deeper place than we normally go to when we're talking about politics. Number one, we're really in trouble. Number two, this man is not going to be beaten by just traditional political strategy. Cambridge Analytica is a military-grade propaganda weapon. That is what was used last time. It uses data mining, some of it from very shadowy forces. It is a weapon of war. The capacity of that company, which of course now rebranded and renamed itself, its capacity to manipulate and to trigger and to propagandize is almost beyond what any of us can imagine. We will have that, plus the shamelessness and the narcissism that we have all come to know too well, plus the power of incumbency. We will not override that with traditional political strategy. The part of the brain that rationally analyzes an issue is not the part of the brain that decides who to vote for. The problem with the level of fear tactics that what I just described represents is that it dismantles reason. We have seen this in history. We have seen it. There is very little on this planet that is more dangerous. There is only one force that can override fear in the human brain. And that is what happens when people are inspired by love of someone to do whatever it takes to save them. We need to so love our country right now. We need to so love each other right now. We need to so love our own children. We need to so love children on the other side of town. We need to so love the children on the other side of the world. We need to so love other people in this world. And we need to love the planet on which we stand. And we need to so love our great, 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 great unborn grandchildren that we will do anything, as John F. Kennedy said, we will go anywhere, we will bear any burden, and we will pay any price. And then, when we have risen to that level, that, oh, we're here now. It's like when Winston Churchill said, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other option. It is true. Sometimes Americans get there late. The whole world knows sometimes Americans are sleeping. It is true. Sometimes we get there late. It is very late, but it is not midnight yet. And we're going to do what other generations have done before us. We might get there late, but we're going to slam it because we're here now. And that is something that happens inside us. And so we need a candidate who inspires. We need a candidate who can match the emotional intensity of this president. We need a candidate who is laying it down and getting real and talking about things that the political establishment does not necessarily want to talk about, because if they were to talk about, we would realize their own culpability in creating the problem. And so I believe we need a season of repair, and we need to not pretend we do not need this season of repair. We need to be adult enough to understand that we need to take some measures, and we need to take some measures quickly. These are the things that we'll do if you elect me president. Number one, we need to repeal that 2017 $2 trillion tax cut that gives 83 cents of every dollar to the richest individuals and corporations, although we should put back in the middle class tax cut. We should stop those corporate subsidies, like $26 billion that went to oil and gas alone last year. Martin Luther King said, if they give it to poor people, they call it a handout. If they give it to rich people, they call it a subsidy. The next thing we need to do is that the United States government needs to be able to negotiate lower drug prices with big pharmaceutical companies, which they cannot do right now. Why? Because they gave away that right. Why? Because of lobbying from big pharmaceutical companies. Last year alone, the lobbying from pharmaceutical companies was $284 million. Even oil and gas was only $125 million. And all of this is happening while Americans are dying because they cannot afford their insulin. The next thing we need to do is we need to take a good look at the military budget of the United States. I think that the U.S. military should have every dollar that they say they need. I do. They should have every dollar that they say they need to keep us safe. The problem is that over and above what the military says they need to keep us safe are hundreds of billions of dollars that have to do only with short-term profit maximization for defense contractors. You see, we don't have a universal health care system yet, because actually incentivizing health in this country would diminish the profits of health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies. And we do not have an agenda to wage peace so much as we have an agenda for endless preparation for war, because to actually work towards creating peace on this planet would diminish projects for defense contractors. There is no reason for you and me to pretend about this. There's no reason to pretend to ourselves, and there is no reason to pretend to each other that this is not rotten to the core. We have a corporate aristocracy. It is health insurance companies, it is big pharmaceutical companies, it is gun manufacturers, it is food companies, it is chemical companies, it is agribusiness, it is defense contractors. It appears to be many different problems, but there's really only one, and that is the deeper problem of the effects, the corruption that is now infused into our system of government by this corporate aristocracy. Now, number one, I want a Department of Children and Youth, because this virulent strain of capitalism wants to squeeze as much as it can out of workers in order to increase its profits. That's why the attack on unions. You know, before the 1980s, a CEO could not be paid in stock options, because once a CEO can be paid in stock options, then there's an obvious conflict of interest, where the CEO will make less money if the worker is treated better, okay? So what has happened is that the idea here is to squeeze people so that they are desperate to work for short wages, right, for lesser wages. But there are two groups of people that this virulent strain of capitalism has no use for whatsoever, because it's not even about short wages, it's that they can't serve that system at all. And those two groups of people are children and the elderly. This country should not be run like a business, ladies and gentlemen. It should be run like a family. You take care of your children and your older people first. And that is why I say we need a mother in the White House. You can take that however you want. We need to realize when you have 13 million hungry children in the richest country in the world, you have 100,000 homeless children in the richest country in the world. What we need is not just more political mechanics. We need a political visionary. We need someone with moral certitude. That is what this country is missing, is moral certitude. What we need in a president is someone who says, that stops now. Every school in the United States should be a palace of learning and culture and the arts. We need a massive realignment of investment in the direction of our children. And I'll tell you what country has this figured out. China has this figured out, because anybody who's thinking in terms of long-term economics has this figured out. You know, every time people in the media or in politics these days say the economy is doing good, you know, I'm a philosopher. Don't use that word good around me and not expect me to question. It is not good. You don't have a good economy when 93 million people live near poverty. You don't have a good economy when 13 million children are hungry. We have elementary school children who go into school and ask the teacher if maybe they have some food for them. We have elementary school students on suicide watch. We have elementary school students and other public school students who, according to psychologists, are experiencing a level of PTSD that is as severe as the PTSD of any veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq. Think about your workplace. Think about where you work. Perhaps you work at a hair salon. Perhaps you work at a department store. Perhaps you work at a yoga studio. Now think about what your life would be on a daily basis if there was now an established pattern of mass shootings in department stores, or an established pattern of mass shootings at yoga studios, or an established pattern of mass shootings at a hair salon. Wouldn't you live with a little bit of nervousness that you don't have now? Our children live with it every day. Why aren't we discussing that on the debates? We're not even having a national conversation about the trauma of the American child. We're talking about the symptom. We're not talking about the cause. We're not going deeper. We have one mental health counselor for every 1,500 children in the United States in the public schools. We need community wraparound services. We need trauma-informed education. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolution. We need anti-bullying. We need violence prevention. We need mindfulness in the schools. But what has happened? These children are citizens, the vast majority of them are citizens, and our Declaration of Independence says that our government is instituted to secure the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I would ask you, where are these children's right to pursue happiness? And also I remind you that in the Declaration of Independence, not only does it say that it is the purpose of government to secure those rights, but it also says, the one I love the most, if the government's not doing its job, it is the right of the people to alter it or to abolish it. Now, I'm not suggesting that we abolish it, but you sure better believe I'm suggesting that we alter it. Only the people can. So what we need to do is to step in. That is what the abolitionists did, and that is what the suffragettes did, and that is what the civil rights movement did. It was time for the people to step in. These children, their despair has simply been normalized by the political establishment, and it's just going to be normalized by the political establishment. Why? Because these children aren't old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency. These children aren't old enough to work, so they don't have any financial leverage. And so they're just kind of peripheralized. Where it's dictated, I think that we have not even begun to take in the ubiquitous power of social media, the ubiquitous power of television, the ubiquitous power of these sources of information, which actually peripheralize some of the most important conversations that we should be having. You know, when I've made the biggest mistakes that I've ever made in my life, in looking back at those mistakes, there were two things I realized. Number one, that I actually didn't wake up that morning intending to be a jerk. I didn't wake up that morning intending to make one of the biggest mistakes I would ever make in my life. The other thing I've realized is a blind spot is exactly that. You're blind. And my most fortunate moments in life have been when somebody shook me by the shoulder. What are you thinking? Marianne, what are you thinking? We need to say that to ourselves now. We need to say that to each other. You don't let 13 million children go hungry. And let me tell you what else you don't do. We have to stop the immoral way that we base our educational funding primarily on property taxes. That is immoral. That means if a child is raised in a financially advantaged neighborhood, then the chances of that child having a very high quality public school education is very good. But if that child is in a disadvantaged neighborhood, we have millions of American children who go to school every day in classrooms that do not even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read. And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically diminished and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. That's why they call it a cradle-to-prison pipeline. But we're not discussing this. We have major mainstream news channels who have whole pieces every single day on the news about whether or not the market is depressed. We need to be talking about whether or not our children are depressed. And we need to be talking about why so many people in America are depressed. I'm so tired of hearing all these politicians telling us what they're going to do about the mental health crisis. I have an idea, guys. Stop driving everybody crazy. Everybody's like this today. Everybody's like this. I don't know what will happen if I get sick. When you have millions of Americans who are working at jobs that that they don't like, but they're only there because of the health insurance and other benefits. When you have millions of young people who, in the prime of their lives, who should be going after their dreams, but they're afraid to go after their dreams because if they were to go after their dreams, it would be in the direction of a career that they look 10 years down the road and can't be sure that it would ever help them pay off these college loans. So you have too many people unhappy. You have many people living in despair. All public policy, and if you make me president, this is what it's going to be. All public policy, both domestic and international, should be based around one core principle, and that is this: what would help people thrive? Yeah. What would help people thrive? That's why we should have universal health care, and that's why we should have free college, and that's why we should have the removal of these college loans, so people can soar. We have millions and millions of Americans who work hard every day but can't make it on one job, so they come home at the end of the day after 2 jobs or 3 jobs, and they don't have the bandwidth to be there for their partner. They don't have the bandwidth to be there for the little child who just wants mommy or daddy to read them a bedtime story. We have too many Americans who are jobs that they don't like. We have too many Americans living in situations that make it very, very difficult for a person to spread their wings. And guess what happens when a person is able to spread their wings? When a person is able to soar? When a person does have the space to become all that they can be? You know what comes from that? Peace and prosperity. You want to talk about money? You want to talk about people who would say, oh, this is not economically sound? Let me tell you about economically sound. Every American kindergartner, every American small child, every time we fail to actualize the intellectual and cultural and moral potential of a small child, we are leaving on the table millions and possibly billions, possibly trillions of unrealized economic potential in the years ahead. You want to have an incredible economy 10 years from now, 15 years from now? Take better care of your 10-year-olds today. And as far as the older people are concerned, it's absolutely immoral what we're doing in this country. We should absolutely scrap the cap when it comes to Social Security, paying into Social Security. We should not only protect Social Security, we should expand Social Security. And we should have a universal basic income that does not stop at 65, that continues. Why? Because the resources of this country should belong to its people. We have been trained to expect too little. We have been trained to just accept crumbs, and we've been told that what money is what comes from a bunch of corporate chieftains, many of whom are nice people. This is not about individuals, this is about systems, dropping crumbs from their table in the form of job creation. That's not where money comes from. Money comes from the creativity and the productivity of the American people. Anytime we invest in a person, we are going to see, because of that, economic potential realized down the road. We need to have a Department of Peace, just like we have a Department of Defense. I've already told you about our national security agenda being driven more by short-term profits for huge multinational defense contractors than it is by any agenda to one day have a peaceful planet. We have whole generations now that have grown up in this country who don't even remember a time when America was not at war. So it's become normalized. That was the plan, see? Nobody even thinks anymore to imagine a time without it. We need to challenge the idea that war is just inevitable. You know, John F. Kennedy said that if we do not end war, war will end us. How many generations do you think we can go along like this? Just, you know, we're going to keep the Iranians from having a nuke. We're going to keep the North Koreans from having a nuke. How long do you think that this can go on? Even Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense under George Bush, said, we must learn to wage peace. You can't just take medicine. You also have to cultivate your health. And you can't just prepare for war. You have to cultivate peace. When you have a $760 billion military budget, but only a $40 billion State Department budget, and within the State Department, $17 billion that goes to the USAID for long-term development and humanitarian assistance, you can see how much more of our resources go towards preparing for war than for preparing for peace. If I'm President of the United States, we will have a Department of Peace as well as a Department of Defense. And the peace-building agencies within our government, most of which are in the State Department, will be given an equal seat of power at the table of our national security agenda. Just like we have a military academy, we should also have a peace-building academy. These are not just small incremental changes. And my whole health plan, and all of these things, I hope that you will look at my website at Marianne2020.com. Do we need universal health care? Absolutely we need universal health care. But we need to go deeper than that. We need to ask ourselves why so many Americans are sick. Why do we have such a higher level of chronic illness in our country than do the citizens in other countries of comparable wealth? When we do that, we recognize it's because of the food companies, the chemical companies, agribusiness, oil and gas, all of the entities which are allowed to spew such poison into our water and put such poison into our food and put such toxins into our air. And the economic system itself in this country, which drives so many into such a state of chronic anxiety, that stress itself produces illness. And also, we now know that there are lifestyle changes and dietary changes, which actually are equally beneficent in terms of treating disease as certain pharmaceutical and other medical treatments. But because of all the big pharma money that goes into our medical school training, and because of all of the ways that Big Pharma is able to dominate our health insurance, our health system, including health insurance, too many Americans don't even know what those other options are. And even when they know what those other options are, they are not covered in insurance. In my whole health plan, I want to do more than provide universal health care. I want to provide universal access to greater health. And that is what my whole health plan does. It actually incentivizes health and makes sure that every American is aware every time you have an illness that you are informed that that's one of your rights. It should be every patient's right, not only to hear what the pharmaceutically dominated treatment is or what the traditional allopathic treatment dominated is, but also that you will actually have access to a website where it is mandated that you are also shown the other opportunities and the statistics that go along with them, and those things will be paid for as well. These are the kinds of changes that we need to make. They are not just incremental changes. They are fundamental changes. We need a fundamental pattern disruption of the economic and political and social patterns which dominate our country today. The one last thing that I want to mention, and then I will be quiet and I will answer any questions that you have and we can talk about anything that you want, has to do with cleaning up our historical debts. Whether you're a person or an individual, you're not going to have the future you want if you're not willing to clean up the past. It is time to pay reparations for slavery, and it is time to take some reparative measures towards Native Americans. Germany paid $89 billion to Jewish organizations since World War II. Doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it has gone far towards establishing reconciliation between Germany and the Jews of Europe. Instead, in our country, we just take this toxic baton and we pass it down generation to generation. It is time to actually pay reparations, not just have a plan, not just have a study. We have plenty of evidence, and we know what happened, and we know what we can do. My plan for reparations is it's not a suck on the U.S. economy, it's a stimulant to the U.S. economy. My plan is for $500 billion that would be dispersed over 20 years by Reparations Council, and the stipulation on the part of the U.S. government is that the money is to be used for purposes of economic and educational renewal. It has now been established that if black families were to manifest as much wealth as white families, and you know, a black person in America who has the exact same educational level of achievement and the exact same level of professional achievement compared to a white person statistically makes less money. But it has been established that if black families manifest as much wealth as white families, that our economy would be $1.5 trillion larger. Paying reparations in a way that goes only to economic and educational renewal for that population to whom we owe a historical debt will be a stimulant on everybody's economy. But even more than that, it will be moral repair for the United States. It is not just about economic restitution. What reparations do is that they carry an inherent mea culpa, an acknowledgement on the part of a people of a historical wrong and a historical debt and the willingness of that generation to pay that debt. I think what should be obvious from everything I've said is that I want to end an aberrational chapter of American history. Nothing that I've said should be considered weird or out there, because everything that I've said is common sense. When you're living at a point when that which is simply common sense, that which is simply the loving thing to do, you feed your children, you educate your children, you take care of your earth, just like we need a massive World War II level mass mobilization to reverse climate change. The idea that we need to do that so that we will not have mass social collapse within 20 years should not be considered out there. And the fact that it in any way is shows you what trouble we're in. And so I don't think we need anything same old, same old. I don't think same old, unfortunately, will even be able to do the job that so many of us want done in 2020. More than that, if we do go same old, even if we win in 2020, as I said, we'll still just be moving the deck chairs on the Titanic. Ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, we need to be a generation that rises up the way others have before us. Abolitionists rose up and said, slavery, it's over now, we're going another way. The women's suffragettes looked at institutionalized white suppression of women, and they said, that's over now, we're going another way. And civil rights movement were people who looked at segregation, and they said, that's over now, we're going another way. It's our turn. All the things I mentioned to you, that stuff needs to be over now. We need to go another way. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.